Hello there! In this video I'll be giving aluminum 3D carving a go with my new CNC machine by trying to make a fishing lure. And while I'd love to say I absolutely nailed it on my first attempt, that was not the case. The first attempt went a little something like this. Yeah, that was hard to watch. Now, fortunately, the second attempt I didn't lose any bits, but the surface finish sucked, and it had its own issue too, only being clamped on one side. Now, there's no audio, but you can clearly see it teared away only being clamped on one side, and that meant quite a bit of post-processing was needed to get it finished. But, you know what they say, third time's the charm, and by then I think I finally got some settings that won't destroy my bits. Speaking of settings, although I figure I'm probably the most clueless person out there when it comes to CNCing, I figured there might be at least one person out there with a similar setup who might benefit from seeing what the settings were. The first tool path was a 3D pocket as the roughing operation, and the settings were 254mm for the feed rate, 80mm for the plunge rate, and the maximum step down was 0.25mm. Although I should mention, looking back on the footage, I think that was a little bit too aggressive. I'd probably bump that down to 0.2, 0.1, depending how adventurous I'm feeling. Next up for the finishing operation was a paralleling tool path, and I should mention all this was done with a 1/8 inch O Flute End Mill. The speeds and feeds ended up being identical to the first tool path. The only difference was when I did the second step down, I ended up picking 0.15mm, and my step over was 0.1mm to try and get a really shiny surface finish. Finally, for the last operation, I did a 2D contour to cut the piece out, and the speeds and feeds were identical, the only difference being that the step down was 0.2mm. I'll also mention while I set the machine up that I'll make all the files available on Thingiverse. At this point, I'm just zeroing my Z-axis and getting ready to run the first operation. Mind you, this was not the first attempt. As you can see, the stock has already been beat up pretty bad by previous failed attempts, but we'll go ahead and regardless get started on our first operation. And like I said earlier, this was a little bit more aggressive than I think I should have ran it, but I ended up adding a little bit of lube, and that seemed to help things quite a bit. This is what the stock looked like after the roughing operation, and now it was time to get into the finishing operation to try and make the surface a little more shinier to cast light off the lure. And after the first pass, it was quite a reveal to come by with the compressed air and see what the surface looked like. Much, much, much better than what it was before. On to the second pass, and then the finishing operation will be completed. I think another project I gotta do is make an enclosure for this thing, because blowing aluminum chips everywhere made quite a mess. But, nonetheless, here's what the surface looked like after 2 passes. I couldn't help but to run my finger along because this was way smoother than any of my previous attempts. Lastly, it was time to cut the piece out with the 2D contour operation. And I can see the nice thing about having it clamped on both sides is the part doesn't immediately tear out after the first end is cut out. And here's what the third attempt ended up looking like. Way better than the first 2. The only post-processing that was needed was just to take a file and kind of deburr the edges a little bit. To save time, I just used the CNC to mark out where the hole should be, and used my drill press to make the final cut. For the back of the lure, I just used some sandpaper and used it to clean up the back. At this point, all that's left to do is to add a hook, hook it up to the fishing rod, and see what it looks like in the water. And even on a cloudy, overcast day, this silvery looking thing could reflect enough light to be seen jiggling in the water with ease. And there we have it. Although it took me a couple of attempts, eventually I was able to get a decent 3D carve on my 3018 CNC machine. Thank you for watching.